right, welcome to session 5 of the Rabbi and the Shrink. This is Dr. Margarita Guri, Dr. Red Shoe, and my favorite rabbi, Rabbi Yonason Goldson. Rabbi?
Margarita, doctor?
I asked the rabbi, what do you want to talk about today? And given all that's happened in the world, since our mission is to talk about everyday ethics, to help everyone figure out how to talk about what we agree on, disagree on, what we believe and think, and how to behave on it, the rabbi said, cancel culture. Now, when he said it, I thought he said cancer culture. Not as much fun this. So we're talking about cancel culture. Rabbi, I think it was interesting when I asked why that. So why cancel culture, sir?
Well, for one, it's in the headlines, and anything that's relevant in the news is probably worth talking about, either favorably or unfavorably. But it's becoming more and more of a relevant issue. And it's something that's really quite challenging in many ways, because we know there are certain lines that should not be crossed. In your tradition, Catholicism, and in my tradition, Judaism, we have concepts of excommunication, that people can act in a way that is so contrary to the values of society that they forfeit the privilege of remaining a member of society. And that line should be there. The problem is when that line becomes moved, when excommunication becomes not a device to be employed. It's not the nuclear option, but rather it is part of the culture. And that shuts down communication, and that creates groupthink, that singularity of thought and ideas that becomes oppressive, that leads to calcified thinking, and that ultimately prevents a culture from being vibrant and engaging and alive.
I think that the idea of groupthink is scary. You and I were talking about that one of our missions is to have everyone be able to have an opinion and have a disagreement. What happens with groupthink for everybody? What happens?
Well, I always go back to sort of the paradigm of constructive disagreement in Jewish tradition, which are the two great Jewish academies of Hillel and Shammai. And I don't know if I may have mentioned this in a previous episode, that when they would argue in the study hall, history says that they argued with such passion as it was as if they fought with swords and spears. But when they left the study hall, they were friends. They got along. They married their sons and daughters to each other. And even though the majority opinion followed the students of Hillel, when they recorded Jewish law, they always cited the opinions of Shammai, and they always cited them first. Because only when you understand an opposing opinion do you really understand your own. And so if we shut down people that we don't like their ideas, rather than engaging them, then really we are on insecure footing ourselves. We haven't examined our own ideas thoroughly, and that may be the motivation for it. I'm insecure because I don't really know why I believe what I believe, or I feel this is important, but I can't defend it intellectually, or I can't articulate the reasons for it, and therefore I'm threatened by people who feel or believe otherwise. And rather than trying to engage them and get to the truth and get to a deeper level of understanding, I shut them down. I only allow people in my circle who think what I think, who say what I say, who believe what I believe. And we don't really have any substantive conversations. We just go around in a circle, reaffirming and nodding and becoming more and more calcified in our thinking and more convinced that we're right and everybody else is wrong.
Well, in all of our case on this podcast, that's certainly true, right?
Well,
Aren't we always right?
We worked hard to get here.
And I think the idea of everyone being right or wrong is certainly, if you're right once, doesn't mean you're right forever. I asked a bunch of children. Children have this way of looking at the world that makes me happy. So asked a bunch of children in my life that are ranging from age 5 to 21. And let's say I know 21 is officially grown up, but yeah, not so much. So I asked them, what does cancel culture mean to you? And my favorite answer came from a 6-year-old. She said, you're canceled. It's us versus them, and you're the them. Bye. And I thought that was the best answer. And I think that kind of sums up how a lot of alleged grown-ups behave. Um, what do you think about that? Canceling people. And her idea was you can't agree with them because then no one will like you. So the idea of cancel culture was distancing yourself from the not us to protect yourself. So what do you think about that, sir?
Well, to begin with, I think that when you really want to get a new view on a subject, talk to children. And so I applaud you for that initiative.
They're the biggest sages in my life. Well, that and my dogs.
You know, what do they say? Out of the mouths of babes, oft time come gems, right? That's it. You know, children have a fresh way of looking at the world. I thought you were going to say something else, that children are never afraid to ask why. And
well, some children.
Well, okay.
Children who have been treated well,
yeah,
and who trust their minds, and who are encouraged to think, are never afraid to ask why.
Yeah. I mean,
and that's not true of most children, I think, in the world.
Well, you know, what happens is, is why aren't they afraid of why? Because children know they don't know anything. The whole world is before them, and they're filled with wonder, and everything is a door to open, an opportunity to investigate, a new frontier to explore. And they just want to soak up information. But what happens is that the more we learn, the more protective we become of what we know. And therefore, the more insecure we may become about anything that threatens the worldview that we have developed up until that point. And that's why the older we get, the more frightening it can be to have to re-examine. If I've only held on to a particular point of view for 5 or 10 minutes, or a couple of days, or a couple of weeks, okay, I can change my mind. If I've been invested in an idea for 10, 20, 30, 40 years, and now I'm going to say, well, maybe that's wrong. That means that my whole life has been a lie.
I think that's very smart. My father always said that the more you know what you don't know. And that is a whole certain point of view with how to deal with new thinking and uncertainty. And we have from Malcolm, how do you deal with people that are not open to discussion? They have their opinion and won't listen to others. Oh, you're talking about family, huh? Okay. So
I wouldn't answer that. That's just his opinion.
Boom, boom. Oh, that's funny, Dave Bricker. You're a funny one. So this is a great question. Put in the chat. How do you deal with people that are not open to discussion? They have their opinion and won't listen to others. Put it in your chat. What do you do? I'm putting in the chat to afford people some privacy and further discussion.
Yeah, while we're thinking about it, I actually just had this exchange, and a similar exchange online this morning. Someone replying to one of my videos, that frontal assault is an effective approach in some military settings. But when you want to preserve some sort of rapport, when you actually want to convince somebody or keep the opportunity open to communicate, so frontal assault is not a particularly effective way of doing that. Whereas if you come obliquely, and I've actually had this conversation with Dave Bricker about the little I know about sailing, where he is an expert. If you want to sail into the wind, you sail in obliquely, cutting back and forth. And the wind helps you move against it because you're coming at an angle. If you try to go straight into the wind, it doesn't work. And so to have a technique where you don't attack the person, you can use phrases like, there are some people who think, or I understand that some people have this opinion. You make it impersonal. And in debate, they sometimes call it having a straw man. It's where you create a sort of abstract or artificial opponent and put him off to the side. And now we can start to talk about it more in the abstract and start maybe creeping towards some kind of a common ground or some area where we can really get into the nitty-gritty.
So I'm going to say something before I read the comments. The answer to, I think, Malcolm's question comes with another question, of course, typical of a rabbi and a shrink, right? So how do you deal with people not open to discussion? My first question is, what is your end goal? Depends on what do you want to be the outcome of this discussion. Are you trying to bend people to your will? Are you actually trying to discern each other's opinion? What I think you have to ask yourself honestly, which is very hard to be frank with ourselves, especially when we're scared or mad or are so righteous, what do I want as the outcome? So I always ask, what is the outcome you intend? So now let me read the answers here. The answer to what do you do if someone doesn't seem to be open to discussion? Ask permission to discuss. If they aren't open, don't waste airtime. Don't waste your air. I think it's also important to distinguish communication and conversation. We'll address that in a second. And the other question comes in from Dave Bricker. Are you open to considering the merits of a different idea? Few people will openly declare themselves as not open. That's true. Even if they are clearly not open, few people will acknowledge that they're not. And I'm not sure people always know that they're not truly open. All right, so let's deal the issue of communication versus conversation. Rabbi, what are your thoughts on that? That's a good one.
I'm sorry, repeat the question, please. I was reading the chat.
All right. So I think it's also important to distinguish communication and conversation. That comes from Malcolm. Let me see, who's that from?
Aya.
What is that from? Aya. Okay, from Aya. And so the question is, what is the difference between communication and conversation?
Well, this brings me back to one of my favorite sound bites, which I heard from my psychology professor in college, who described the way people appear to have conversations of what he called dialogues of the deaf. And one of my guilty pleasures is eavesdropping on other people's conversations, and I don't get to do it as much as I used to. One because we're all in quarantine, but I used to ride buses a lot, or if you're at airports, and even then that's no good anymore because people are all plugged into their devices, so they're generally not having conversations. But if you have the chance to listen in on two people having a conversation, what you discover is they're not really talking to each other. They're talking at each other. And one person talks and talks and talks until usually he runs out of air and has to pause to breathe. And the other person jumps in and she talks and talks and talks, not responding to what the first person said, but talking about what she wants to talk about until she pauses, and then he jumps back in, picks up where he left off. And so they leapfrog over each other. And they're really having monologues, but it looks strange to be talking to yourself. So you need somebody else there so it looks like you're having a conversation, but there's really no communication taking place. They're just speaking what they want to say, and nobody's really listening to anyone else. That's neither communication nor conversation. It simply resembles conversation. So really, I like the question because I don't think there should be a difference unless I'm giving a speech. If I'm giving a speech, that's not a conversation. That's a communication. But if two people are actually there to exchange ideas, it should be a conversation. And in order for it to be a conversation, there has to be communication.
And unfortunately, one thing I know is that many people are not particularly skilled, or motivated listeners. Many times someone's nodding, you think they're listening, but really they're already thinking about what they're going to say. They're thinking about how to get their point across. So, they don't say, so let me see if I get it right. Is this what you're saying? They don't ask more questions. So one of my questions is, let's add another C. We have conversation and communication, but what happened to curiosity? Where does our sense of wonder, the good rabbi was talking about children and wonder, and the catechis talk about adulthood and adultitis, and the whole idea of wonder in our lives. What happens to the idea of wonder and curiosity when we're in alleged two-way conversation? What happens to it? Let's put that in the chat, and then while you're doing that, let me see. Rabbi, one of the questions is, some people's world collapses. They cannot trust authority figures. The president says the election was stolen. Anything else is fake news. Deification.
That was a response to Clearman's comment before that one.
Oh, okay. All right. Deification of leaders, nationalism, a recipe for groupthink. Let's get back to that one a bit later. So I want to talk about this listening. What gets in the way of listening is really the question.
Well, if I can jump in on your comment about curiosity.
Sure.
And something that I'm sure we'll come to from time to time as we go. But I have an acronym of ethics, and the I is inquisitiveness, which is another word for curiosity.
And what's the rest?
Well, we'll get to that. Let's
Okay.
stay focused for now on this topic. That
All right.
If I'm not open to new information, right? That's called. There's a term for that. I don't know whether it's willful ignorance or calculated ignorance, something like that. Because I made a decision that I don't want to know anything more than I know now. Well, that is intrinsically unethical, because if I don't have all the information that's available to me, then I can't possibly know whether I'm right or not. So your question, why are we not curious? What has happened to curiosity? It's really at the heart of this cancel culture discussion. I don't want to open myself up to information that may force me to reevaluate my worldview. And
so let me pose a counter to that. Sometimes I don't think it's that we don't want to. I see some people being exhausted or abused, dealing with trauma, they haven't slept enough, and they're not able to listen. I think it takes a certain amount of wellness to really listen, to take in the new world. I mean, we have Marie Kondo going around asking everyone, does this item spark joy, so they can get rid of clutter in a house? I think many people, new ideas becomes a noise or a clutter that they can't take in because they're surviving. So one of my questions is, and I don't think that that's unethical if you can't listen because you're surviving, that opens lots of other questions about self-care and ethics, but that we're not there right now. Is it unethical always if someone is unable to listen? Say yes or no in the chat. Is it unethical? And normally I would say thumbs up and thumbs down, but not everyone's on the camera. Is it unethical to not be able to listen all the time?
Dave Bricker gives us the answer that is an answer for any question.
Depends. I know. Thank you, Dave Bricker. Methinks you are a writer. So Libby Kisner says, no, I don't think so. And we have Aya says, of course not. So it's interesting that the women are coming off strong, understanding. Like, for instance, if a little girl asks a question in a classroom, she may begin to be the bad guy just for asking questions and being open. And perhaps, depending on the culture, if a boy asks the same question, they don't get in trouble. Now, I'm an old grandma. When I was young, I had to ask all the boys to ask my questions for me because the teachers would answer the boys, but not me. Because I was a girl and I shouldn't be asking those questions. I remember in Sunday school, I got sent to the principal's office, which is a scary nun with a big paddle, because I asked the following question. If Adam and Eve had two sons, did one of her sons marry Eve so that they could have more children to populate the earth? I got sent to the office faster than my head could spin. And I didn't know why. Luckily, my parents were called in, and my father said, it's a perfectly reasonable question. Why was she ushered out? And I had an advocate. Children with advocates, I think, are allowed to ask questions and can learn to ask neutral questions rather than defiant frontal assault, like you were talking about questions, right?
And you were canceled, right?
I was canceled big time.
Probably.
And I was, for the rest of the year, put in the back of the room and then had to whisper. I was the question whisperer to the boy next to me,
So
who could then ask my questions.
Without knowing the nun in question, I guess she was second to none.
And my favorite nun ended up telling me, just ask her the questions directly. I had a favorite nun, Sister Paul Joseph, who is Sister Rita Baum now. They changed their names to their birth names. And she was a philosopher and an ethicist.
So I'm going to suggest
she's the best kind of teacher you could ever have. And
that's what you want. That's what you want as a teacher.
Yes.
But I'm going to guess that the nun that you asked didn't have an answer.
I'm going to guess that she thought I was being a troublemaker. Even I'm going to guess you're right. You're right. She didn't have an answer, but she also thought I was being defiant to ask such a question. I didn't know what incest was at the time. And I didn't know I was asking a bad question. I mean, if I knew, I wouldn't have asked it that way.
Well, I mean, it's a perfectly reasonable question. And according to rabbinic tradition, Cain and Abel were born with sisters. Because if there's only one man and one woman, people have to come from somewhere. You're going to have to marry your sister, marry your brother, because there's just nobody else around. So how do we deal with that? That's a theological discussion for another time. But to ask the question, what's wrong with asking a question? I mean, I remember once when I was a kid, I heard a joke in school and I didn't understand it. So I asked my parents. And my mother's reaction was, oh my gosh. Because even though there were no swear words in it, it was alluding to something that was very off color. And to my parents' credit, they did not slap me or wash my mouth out of the stove. They explained to me what it meant and why we don't talk like that. And that's what parents and teachers should do. When children have questions, we want to encourage them and make it, that's the real safe space. The safe space is where I am free to investigate, to explore, to ask questions, to examine ideas. And we're free to challenge each other. It's safe because there's nobody's attacking anybody. We're simply trying to get to a deeper level of understanding. And if we're going to cancel people and shut people down, then we're going to encourage the kind of groupthink that then perpetuates more canceling and more shutting down.
Yeah, well, I agree with that. I mean, one of my friends is an Orthodox Jew. I haven't seen her in years. We studied for our licensing for my psychology license years and years ago. And she used to do the same thing my parents would do. A kid would come in with a bad joke or a dirty word. She would explain. She would have them spell it out loud and say it 3 times. Now you know how to spell it. You know how to use it. You know how to say it. We will never use that word in this house again. And I thought that was pretty clever because the curiosity was addressed. And then bada bing, bada boom, you're done. Now my parents just had to do once. She had to do 3 times, repeat the 3 times, which I thought was interesting. But I think many people don't have that confidence to be able to do that. Okay, so back to listening and curiosity. I don't think we addressed that particularly well. Dave Bricker says, Dave, you want to just say it or do you want me to read it?
Either way.
Okay, well,
just addressing that question of, are you is it okay not to listen? And so I said, if white supremacists want to give me, quote unquote, more information, I'm not interested. I'm not listening. Or if I do listen, it's to find the cracks in their walls or dissuade them, not to entertain their perspective, which brings in other ethical questions about whether or not my listening is actually respectful. I think,
Rabbi, that's a good one for you.
Yeah, that is a good one. And I had an incident, and I don't want to say the person's name because I don't want it to be about him. But I heard a fellow on a talk show excuse me, and he had a quote that I really liked, and so from time to time I'll make memes and post them, but I always like to check out who the authors are because I don't want to quote people that I don't want to quote. So I went and I looked him up, and I found him on Wikipedia, and I found him on a few other websites as a white supremacist, a racist, similar adjectives. And in the interview, when I listened to him, he didn't sound like any of those things. So I went looking for more interviews or speeches from him, and he had some ideas that I understood why they would not be popular. But I never heard him say anything that would really brand him as a white supremacist or a racist. And so I went ahead and I published this meme. A very good friend of mine, friend for years and years and years, wrote back attacking me for quoting him because he's a white supremacist. So I said, well, how do you know he's a white supremacist? Because everybody says he is. Well, who's everybody? What if somebody wrote something about you on Wikipedia? Would you want people to actually research and find out who you actually are, or simply take their word for it? I don't have to research. And I was absolutely appalled that this is somebody that I had known for years. And apparently he just got one of his buttons pushed, but he was so insistent that it wasn't necessary for him to research this individual and actually find out who he was. It left a very, very disappointing taste in my mouth, because maybe the guy really is a racist, maybe he is a white supremacist, but find me some evidence. Don't just tell me that you saw it on Wikipedia. If we know that people are racist, white supremacist, whatever supremacist, there's a point at which you don't have to take people seriously. But just because somebody says they are doesn't make it so.
In fact, that's one of the best ways to cancel someone out, to give them a label. When I first came to this country, I was called by the children in the neighborhood a communist. We were escaping communism, and yet they branded me as a communist because I was Cuban. And that gave them permission to throw rocks at me and push me down and do those other things. And so it's interesting. It's kind of like how do you discern what one really is? I mean, we know you by your works, but I don't think they knew me by my works. How does a 5-year-old communist act, right?
Yeah,
so one of the questions is not just listening, but how do we make up our own opinion about who we're going to listen to and how we're going to listen? And is it ever evil to listen to anyone? Let's ask that one. Is it ever evil to listen to someone? Put it in the chat.
I'll tell you an interesting story.
I love your stories.
One of the great rabbis of the last generation. He came from the town of Panovich in Russia. And so he was called the Panovitcher rabbi, and was enormously influential. And he was asked by his students that they had heard that of all of his colleagues, all of his contemporaries who were in religious seminary with him, they had all become communists. He lived through the communist revolution, and they had all become communists, and he didn't. And they asked him why. What was the difference between him and all of his contemporaries? And he said, I'm not sure. I can't really identify a difference, but he says there's one incident that stuck in his mind. And he said that there was a big communist thinker who was going to be speaking at a rally, and everybody wanted to go hear this person. He was like I don't know who the equivalent would be today, but some really compelling speaker that is in the news. Everybody wants to hear this person. Well, he wanted to hear him too, but they had a schedule in the seminary. And in order to be at the start of the rally, they had to leave early. And he said, you know what? There are introductions, there are pre-speakers. I'm going to stay till the end of the time we're supposed to be studying. And then I'll go after that. I'll miss the introductory stuff. I'll get there in time for the big speaker. So everybody else left early. He stayed behind. Well, long story short, he got waylaid. He got there late, or didn't get there at all. It was all over. And he didn't hear this speaker. And everybody else did. And he said that the only thing that he could think of is that everyone else was exposed to that speaker's ideas and I wasn't. And he attributed that to the difference. Ideas, especially when they come through the mouth of somebody who is a gifted orator, who is very compelling, especially when it's the message that resonates with the time and everybody's excited about it. You hear a certain speaker, a certain idea in a certain time, and your mind is receptive, and that could change the trajectory of your life. And so
I think that's true.
right?
Oh, I'm sorry, Rabbi.
Just being selective about the ideas that we allow to come into our minds is also part of being responsible in developing our thoughts.
My father would have said, if you have the confidence to listen without it becoming who you are and without getting emotionally attached to the ideas, then you can listen. Until then, I'll tell you what you can listen to. And so when we would listen to things that were maybe not good, he would listen with us and then help us. He would debrief us on our opinion and what we heard. And that's kind of interesting. The idea that it could be dangerous to listen to stuff, whether it's evil or not, if we're not yet ready developmentally. And let's face it, many grown-ups aren't developmentally ready to hear certain things. They buy into it without discernment. So we have now some responses. First is, evil is difficult to define, but rap music gets close. IS says it depends on whether it's evil is, if it's bad to listen to or unethical to listen to evil stuff. Malcolm said, how can you combat evil if you won't listen to it? Bada bing, bada boom. Dave Bricker, it's important to be a discriminating listener, whether the content is evil or not. There's too much junk out there, and to consume all of it is unhealthy. I hear my grandchildren all the time talking about that this is so because they heard something on TV or TikTok, or, they read an article on it without asking questions, like your friend, Rabbi. Sometimes evil loves an audience. You can fight it by tuning away. So there's two responses to that. So we expose ourselves to other people's ideas. Then let's further that discussion. How do we defend ourselves so that we can listen to any idea? How do we prepare?
Well, I think you already touched on that there has to be a certain level of intellectual maturity. And I know that when I started teaching high school, I had become religious. I had asked a lot of difficult questions and learned what I felt were compelling answers. And I wanted to share that wisdom with my students. And as a first-year teacher, I was very confident in my ability to be able to explain anything to anybody. And I had to recalibrate, because I discovered that young minds are not always ready to deal with complicated ideas. They're just not on that level yet. And I hope I didn't do too much damage. Sometimes I had to go into damage control, because I would tell students ideas that they weren't ready to hear, and they would sometimes become very upset or very confused, and then I had to try to walk it back or manage the conversation. So that's really the responsibility of parents and teachers, to be able to assess what children are ready to hear. As a psychologist, I'm sure you know this, that when parents are approaching a traumatic event, like they're going to move to a new city, they're going to, it's divorce, somebody has cancer. How do you prepare children for that? And I remember the advice that I heard once is tell them the least they need to know, and then respond to their questions and answer the questions as they're asked. Don't give them more information than they ask for. And if they want more, they'll ask for it. If they're ready for more, they'll ask for it. If they're not ready for it, they may not be able to handle it yet. Of course,
With kids, I think we can ask first, tell me, what is your understanding? What do you know? And find out. I think grown-ups are too quick to answer without listening first. What do you know? What do you think? What are you aware of? And I think if we do that, then we can better understand the following questions they may have. What else do you want to know? What's on your mind? And I think that sometimes it's totally okay to say, I don't think you're ready for the full answer. I'm going to tell you the grown-up's been acting in a disappointing way, and we're going to do our best to help them. And I think protecting children from heartbreak and disappointment, from disillusionment, I think is an important thing at times. Sometimes we lie to them. Yes, there is a Santa Claus. No, you will not die tonight. That's a bit of a lie. We don't know. I mean, there was in the Hail Mary, there's a part where you face your death. It's part of a prayer. And I used to say the rosary at night, and I still do actually. And there's that now and in the hour of our death, amen. I used to cry when I was a kid, think I'm going to die, especially since I'd seen guns and stuff in Cuba. And my mother would say later on, she said, well, I just lie. So you're not going to die tonight. Well, we could, who knows? But it's a reassuring thing. So the issue then is, how do you protect children from those kinds of things? Now, are children that different from adults who don't know how to think about things?
That kind of goes back to what you said earlier about if somebody is not really responsible. I mean, there are people with mentally or mentally challenged. Talk about a kleptomaniac. I don't remember if we had this conversation or not. A kleptomaniac is somebody with a compulsion to steal. Every thief's not a kleptomaniac. But you deal with a kleptomaniac differently from the way you deal with a run-of-the-mill thief, because one's making a decision to steal and one has a compulsion to steal. And there are different levels of culpability there. And if you take that principle and apply it to anyone, society has to have standards. We can't give people a pass just because they may have their limits if their actions are going to affect other people and be destructive to individuals or to society. But at the same time, we have to understand that not everybody is responsible for their actions. Not everybody can understand what's being told to them. So it's complicated.
Let's go back to Dave's idea of a discriminating listener. What is the hallmark of a discriminating listener, and what can each of us do to become one? Now, we've been talking for a while, so if you want to unmute and talk, or if you want to put it in the chat, whatever you want. But we're going to ask you to think about what you say and be as direct as you can to honor other people's time. So I just censored everyone, didn't I? Is that unethical to ask people to be pithy?
Well, that's not censorship. That's
right. But some
editing.
People would. I decided to diffuse that anger because I've been told before, if I say things like that, it's censorship. It's not. It's asking people to be discerning communicators, correct?
And the idea of a filter.
A filter.
Ideally, we should filter ourselves. Sometimes we have to filter other people, but that's a lot different from from shutting somebody down completely.
More and more this year, I've actually had to mute some people who've gone on rants about things and been unkind with their use of words or even profanity, which is another discussion.
Yeah.
So what do we need to do to be discerning listeners?
I think the first thing we have to do is actually listen. Let people say what they have to say. I mean, there's a great quote from Stephen Covey. He says, and you mentioned this earlier, most people don't listen with the intent to understand, they listen with the intent to reply. So if I'm formulating my response while you're talking, then I'm not listening. I'm assuming that I know what you're going to say, and I'm more interested in what my response is. Ideally, what we should do is when someone communicates an idea to us, we should paraphrase it back. Common Rogerian counseling technique. Right? So are you saying that? And then I restate what they've said to me in my own words. And that establishes that I've listened, I've heard, gives me the opportunity to determine whether I heard accurately, lets them know that they've been heard. So now they're going to be more willing to listen to me. And we're going to have a more mutually beneficial exchange of ideas.
Which actually goes back to the intent. We have to ask ourselves when we're listening, why are we listening? Is it to understand? Is it to disprove? It's to beat somebody? Why are we listening? So we've answered some of that. First, we have to have a listening approach. Our motivation has to be to understand, to truly listen. And as the rabbi says, first you paraphrase, which is not a summary. It's the gist of an event, in my own words, that would make any of you feel that I actually understood what you're saying. Not that I agree, but that I understand, right? So many people sabotage that with snark. So you have to be neutral in your language. So what else can you do to listen? How do we listen with discernment? I'm going to put that, what are your tricks to be able to listen thoughtfully?
It's sort of a strange question.
Thank you.
Well, it's relevant, but it's I guess it's strange that we have to ask that question.
It is.
Because I think we have to take a step back and say, why are we challenged to listen? Why do we need listening lessons?
Because we don't listen.
Because we don't listen, because we don't want to listen, because we don't want to learn, because we don't want to hear.
Do we have to, I mean, one of the questions is, and we're talking to these kids in my life, well, I don't like that person, so I'm not going to listen. Do we have to like someone or approve of them in order to listen? And the answer, of course, is no.
I thought it depends.
For Daybrook, everything's a depends, but it is also depends. So
I'd say it depends on why we don't like them.
Depends.
Yes, it does depend on. So what are the reasons to not listen?
I think the reasons to not listen are that I've already listened. I've already engaged in conversation. I've already tried to express why I disagree or why I think their ideas are not sound. And I haven't gotten anywhere. There's a point at which I need to cut my losses and say, I don't see there's any benefit. You're not telling me anything that you haven't told me already. And you're not receptive to me responding to what you're saying.
That's right. Which is where we are with many family members. Some people will never listen. And so you just treat them respectfully. You listen, you say, okay, now would you like some tea? And you go off to do something else. I mean, we have to know that even people that we love, if they're speaking in such a way that you disagree with, it is not your job to change their mind. It's not, especially if you know they're not going to listen. And maybe they'll listen eventually when the time is right, but this is not that time. I do not think we have to ethically become the Joan of Arc of truth and discernment and force everyone with our armor on and our sword up to see the light. I think that is not thoughtful. Well, what do you think about that? Should we be Joan of Arc? Are we being unethical?
I think you're making an excellent point that sometimes it's better to just let people have their ideas. I'm not going to change their minds. I'm not going to convince them to see things my way. So there's really no benefit. Now, if their ideas are evil, that may be a problem. But if I simply disagree, this of course is relevant to politics because so much of our country and our world is irreconcilably divided between one ideology and another. And I don't have to make it my life's mission to try to convince people that I'm right when there's virtually no chance I'm going to do so, especially if they're family, if they're friends, if they're people that I have a basis for a relationship with. Let them have their ideas. I suppose I can make a request or perhaps even a condition. I'd rather just not talk about some of these things because I don't see there's any benefit to doing so.
I think it's even also okay to say we're not going to discuss about communism at the table if you're pro-communist. If you want to have a discussion in the study afterwards, we will be glad to do that if you are open to my ideas. And then I'd like to speak and have you listen. You can set down the conditions. My father had to say that to more than one person who visited our dining room table. Aya, you had a question or a comment.
Yes, please. This is my approach would be in this case that firstly to recognize the situation and who we are talking about or who we are who we have conversation with. For example, to recognize in which level we are talking with that person. Is that something very deeply rooted that there is not any reasonable discussion in this case? Is that something that he or she will refer to another situation and they express themselves in this case that they are not listening at all, or they have some other reason that they behave or they talk like that? Or is that situation in the case that they are really reasonable people with a high level of understanding, and we are arguing in a way that they understand us and they can be convinced? And in order to recognize this situation, for me it is very important to adapt myself to this situation. That shall I take it easy? Shall I convince someone, or shall I only say something or behave some in such a way that they also have more understanding from their own thinking? In which situation how I can talk, or in which language I can convince, or I can only express myself in order to have more impact on that person, depending on their own situation and their own reasons of expression.
So I'm going to stop you there because that's good. The rabbi gave the magic secret code in the decoder ring for that situation. If we want someone to have an interaction where we can convince each other, the secret sauce there is to first let them know we're really listening. Ask questions, paraphrase, give them back what we hear them saying, and then ask them to do the same for us, right? Without it being a back and forth. He also said we could think about a third person. Let's say those who believe, and those, not you and me, but those who believe this or that, right? So I think he gave some great input into that. Rabbi, your thoughts?
In Jewish law, there are a tremendous number of prohibitions against gossip. And when people say, but it's true, we say, yes, that's why it's gossip and not slander. But telling true information that really has no benefit and only does harm is very seriously prohibited. Now, sometimes somebody needs to vent. If my wife comes home and she had a really unpleasant interaction with somebody and she starts going off, I can recognize that she needs to get this out of her system. Now, the prohibition against speaking gossip extends to the listener. I'm not allowed to listen to gossip. So normally I have to tell somebody, I just can't hear that. But if she needs to vent, I'm allowed to listen. I'm not allowed to believe anything she tells me. And I'm allowed to be a sounding board for her. Sounding board's not even the right person. I'm just allowed to be there so she can get it off her chest. So I think I have an observation that we have to evaluate, and this is what you said as well. What's the point of the conversation? What's the point of the exchange? Sometimes we have to recognize that we have to let people talk. They're not really hurt, causing harm. they're not really doing damage, or they need to say this because they'll blow up if they don't. All of these variables, and that's why Dave's answer, it depends, is truly the answer. Because, and again, there's no app for being ethical. We have to take all these variables into account in order that we can function in our relationships. And the answer is going to be different time after time after time.
That's your next meme, Rabbi. There's no app for being ethical.
Well, I think we need to remind ourselves of that. I mentioned this in a different context recently, and I think it applies to bring it back to the cancel culture. When I was in college, Ronald Reagan had just become president, and the Screen Actors Guild had voted to give him the annual Achievement Award, because he had been a longtime actor and now he's president and they wanted to honor him. Well, the president of the Screen Actors Guild at the time was Ed Asner, who was a militant liberal. And he made an executive decision that the award would not be given that year, because he didn't want Ronald Reagan to get the award. So I remember I was in college, and my college roommate thought this was very amusing, that the award had been canceled to keep it from being given to Ronald Reagan. And I said, will you find it just as amusing when a conservative president refuses to give the award to a liberal nominee? And he looked confused and walked away.
It's certainly hard to think. That's a good story. Dave Bricker, you had your hand up.
Just a comment, because you're both professional speakers, and when we speak to an audience, the goal of a speech is to transform the audience, which means that we have to get a whole room full of people to listen to us. And very often they're herded in there because that's their assignment. They're attending the event, the conference, whatever it is. And the boss has said, you guys are all going to listen to Dr. Margarita Guri. And they all say, who the hell is Margarita Guri? I need to check my email. But they, or me or you, Yonason, whatever, because they don't necessarily, we're not famous celebrity speakers. So they go in, and how do we engage that audience? We ask questions, and we ask questions really about them and their experience. Have you ever, fill in the blank? Imagine if you could, fill in the blank. What would it be like? Very often we start a speech with questions, and it's a tremendous listening technique, especially for somebody who's going to be standing on a platform and talking for 45 minutes. And I think that when we are listening to other people, if we ask the right questions as they speak to us, then we can also find ways to steer what they are saying and what they are thinking about, because very often they are venting or spewing by asking the right questions as they speak.
I think that's a brilliant solution. And Dave Bricker is a business transformation storyteller expert. Storysailing.com if you want to check out his stuff. It's got amazing stuff. All right, Rabbi, I think we have time for you to comment, and then the word of the day.
Yes. I was just thinking, I thought, Dave, you were going to go in a different direction.
Well, that's my specialty. Getting your toes.
Sailing into the wind again. And you're absolutely right. The questioning, it's rather than making assertions or making statements, you allow somebody else to express themselves and bring themselves into even if it's in their own minds. But also, I know whether I speak in front of an audience is I do a lot of self-censorship. I can't only talk about the things I want to talk about. I have to anticipate how the audience will respond. And that means if I bring in a political reference, I'm almost inevitably going to alienate half the room. Or in my case, because I'm a moderate, I'm going to alienate the whole room. I have to be very careful deciding, because if I lose people because I've said something that they can't hear or don't want to hear, then I've lost the opportunity to teach them things that might be of value to them. And so I have to always be evaluating where is the audience? I'm there to serve them. I'm there to serve the other person. I'm not there to gratify myself. And in a way that does lead into the word of the day, which is antediluvian, which literally means before the flood. And most of us know the story of Noah and the flood, and that the world was filled with violence. People were at each other's throats. Hard to imagine, isn't it? And God reached a point where he said, if I don't intervene, mankind is going to destroy itself. And so the only way to save mankind is to find the one righteous person left in the world and his family and save them and start over again. You know, there's a famous quote, it's usually attributed to Louis XV, but it's actually spoken by Madame Pompadour, who was a court favorite, that things will last my time, but after me, le déluge, the flood. And she was anticipating the French Revolution, which of course happened under Louis XVI, a generation later. Is that she was able to see that the state of affairs was such, a society was breaking down, and the tension between the aristocracy and the peasants was untenable. If we don't have a civil society, if we don't have a society where people feel that they're treated equitably, where they're heard, that their opinions value, that they make a difference, there's going to be a disastrous, a catastrophic response. And cancel culture is the attempt to basically silence people into submission, and it never works. It only creates more resentment, more divisiveness, more partisanship. We have to be able to have civil, constructive conversations and be able to disagree and listen to each other and understand the other's positions so that we can define our differences, and by doing that, to find common ground.
It would be wonderful if we could do that. So in summary, I have a task for all of you. All of you are listening, and spread the word. Ask yourself first the question, who is it that you feel you want to cancel? Whether it's some of your own thoughts, or a teacher, or a whole school, a community, your mother-in-law, whatever. Who do you want to cancel? And ask yourself, what is it you're having a hard time listening to? Now, if you realize they just can't have a discussion, I'm still going to ask you to try one more time to really listen to them and feedback what they've said. Give it a new try. And then, as you're paying attention to the news, see how other people handle the same task I've asked you to do for yourselves. How are we doing in this world with truly listening and truly trying to understand? That's my last thought. Rabbi, you want to add a last thought, sir?
No, leave it at that. I think that was a beautiful way to end.
All right. Well, our time is up, and I wanted to thank everyone for joining, the Rabbi and the Shrink. And we'll be here every week. Let's see, next week we're going to be talking about, we made a list. We might change it, but depending on the news. I think we're talking about setting limits, which kind of goes with what we're talking about today, whether it's self-discipline, self-censorship, or whatever. Let's talk about setting limits and ethics.